Hi, so welcome back. This is going to be a tutorial about parallax animation. Let's get to it. So this was the example video we've shown you in the beginning of this project. Let's watch what is what. Maybe let's watch it in its entirety, the rendered form. So this was a proof of concept video for a game suggestion, let's say. Okay, and you can clearly see the parallax animation with the foreground, midground and background elements. The playing space is the foreground with all of the items, all of the animation, the cat and the bot, the colored part of the image, and then there is the gray background, or let's say midground, of the rooms that we're supposed to be looking inside of. And then from the background you can see the yard, the garden outside with the fence and the trees and the shrubs and overall blue colored, light blue color. You get the idea. So this is parallax animation at work, and your projects will do something similar, preferably with more layers than this, but this was completed in as short as 2 weeks, so you have ample time to produce this kind of content. Okay, so what we have here basically in After Effects is 3 layers. You can see them over here. Let me enlarge this space so you can read the labels. One is background, FG stands for foreground element, then the MG middle ground element, midground element, and then BG background element. And we have a camera, a 3D camera attached to these objects, because this is considered to be 2.5D animation, meaning that these objects or these layers exist in 3D space, but they are not geometrical. They don't have any volume. They are just cards with transparency, and you can see that here clearly, but they have a z-depth separation because they exist in 3D space. They're not just layered on top. But After Effects is specific in this matter. It is a specific software in this matter because it can render 3D elements and 2D elements at the same time in the same composition. But in order to render these 3D elements, we need a camera. And when I play this back and forth, as you can see, these objects aren't moving anywhere. They are static. They are not animated. They don't have any position animation attached to them. Rather, the camera itself is animated, and thanks to the settings and the placement of these objects, the camera reads into those layers, creating a parallax effect. Okay, so this is what you're going to do, what you're supposed to do in basic form. Okay, so let's start. Let me create a new project. New project. Don't save. Okay. And I'm going to create a new composition, and this composition, you can change the settings later depending on what you need, but in the end we expect you to create a full HD resolution video. Therefore it is going to be 1920 by 1080 pixels, as you can see, with of course square pixel aspect ratio, a frame rate of 24 frames per second, and then duration 10 seconds is good enough for now, but in the end we expect to see 30-second long videos in the final project. But as I've explained it previously, you can easily extend this by going into composition settings. I'm going to name this main comp and call it Parallax. Okay, labeling everything is important because as you have seen in the previous example, I'm sure, the project pane was filled with folders and files clearly labeled in order to explain what is going on. And if you go to my project for Catbot concept, you can clearly see it in the folder structure of my files as well, of my file collection as well. I'm labeling everything. I am taking care of these items so that when I go somewhere I can clearly tell what is what, and maybe weeks, months after this project I can still figure out what file is used for what purpose. Okay, so we highly suggest you do the same thing. You keep your files in a clear folder structure, and use a service like Google Drive or Dropbox. As you can see, I am using Dropbox, so that in the case of something disastrous, you don't lose your files and you can keep working on them regardless of the conditions. Okay, so same thing here. I have a bunch of materials. Efe Hoca did these drawings himself, and let's take a look. They have transparency, so I'm not going to open them up in my favorite image viewer, Irfan View. Irfan View is a really cool image viewer. It will solve most of your image viewing problems. But Efe Hoca's drawings have backgrounds attached, have their backgrounds removed. So over black, it is not going to show anything much. So instead, let me carry these over to Photoshop. Okay. All right. So here's the foreground layer, as Efe Hoca named it, layer 1, and then the midground layer. This is the extended version, and then there is the layer 3, the background. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just cut this thing, chop this thing right down the center, so that later I can show you what you can do for set extensions. Okay, so let's save it. But I also, you know, painted over these and created animation ready versions of them. Let me be clear about this. This is practically thumbnail sketching. This is for just the planning stage. It is not meant to be the final work, but this is good enough for explaining just what is going on. Let's take a look at the sizes of these things. So for example, this thing is 1420 by 1090, good enough. Okay, this is 5000 by 1000, the foremost element, the foreground element. And the midground itself, once again, this was extended, so I'm going to chop it in half. Image size 3000 by 1090. Okay, so these are good enough for beginning, but the purpose of creating this parallax animation at the very beginning is to figure out what you need to create in the end. Because without doing the parallax animation and seeing how much space you need, how many materials you need, or how big these materials should be, you won't be able to finalize your work. You cannot just create these elements in their entirety, in their most detailed form, and then start thinking about the parallax animation. You have to do the animation, the basis of the animation first, and then you will have to adjust your final materials. Okay, so we are good to go with these materials, and it's very important, and I should point this out, these are all PNG files, okay, and they need to be PNG because you're going to see the midground over the foreground element, and you're going to see the background over the midground element. So in order to see behind these objects, you cannot save these as JPEG files. They have to be PNGs. They have to carry transparency data. Okay, so let's go to After Effects. I'm going to create a new folder, call this, let's say, Parallax Assets, okay? Just so I can tell what is what, because in the end, your project is going to be fairly complicated with all of the assets and all of the characters and probably effects that you might want to add. All right, so let's start with our layers. Let's get them in order, okay? So background. In the background, the object that is going to be the furthest away, the furthest behind, let's say, the midground and the foreground. Right now, these elements have a weird scale relationship between each other. We're gonna fix that. So let me turn off foreground and midground using this eye icon right here. This is pretty much self-explanatory. You used Photoshop, you know what this means. And in the background, I'm going to rescale it. So hit either S on your keyboard to turn on the scale, or you can go to this drop-down menu, and from transform, you can select scale, okay? So I have no intention of this thing animating or reacting to my camera movements. I want this thing to stay in the background without any movement. I want this thing to stay static. So there's no reason for me to turn this into a 3D layer. I don't want it to react to my camera movements, as I mentioned. You may choose to have it react to your camera, but in that case, since this is the background element, it should do a very, very small movement. So if you want to do that, you will have to push it way, way into the distance and enlarge it quite big in order to get that really small movement. What I'm explaining right now will be better understood when I start creating the camera and showing you how to set up your layers. So let's keep it 2D for now, but I'm going to go to my midground, and as you can see, this midground will have to react to that camera movement. I will have to convert it into 3D. But a 3D object cannot be visualized properly without a camera in your scene. So right click in the empty space and from new select camera. This is going to come up with the camera settings, and there are many settings here, but I'm only concerned with one thing, just the name camera 1, the focal length. This is going to dictate whether your camera covers a huge area or a very small area or anywhere in between. A good explanation of this would be this chart. So as you can see, when the focal length decreases, your field of vision increases, okay? You get a wide angle lens. And when the focal length increases, then your field of vision narrows down. You get a telephoto lens. Not a zoom lens. Zooming means a variable focal length. You can zoom between two wide angle lenses. Like you can go between 16 millimeters and 24 millimeters. That is called zooming. But yeah, zooming is not getting close to an object or getting a really narrow field of vision. Zooming as a terminology dictates you have a variable focal length. Okay, so you can zoom between wide angle lenses and telephoto lenses, or two telephoto angles. Okay, so with that explanation, this over explanation over the nomenclature of lens design out of the way, let's get to it. So what is the difference between a wide angle lens and a zoom lens? Or a telephoto lens, my bad. So that is going to change not much in terms of the geometric proportions of these objects. Because remember, these things are cards, right? They have no thicknesses. They have no volumes. They have no geometric properties. These are not objects. These are just paper-thin layers hanging in space. So if you were to change the lens type while weaving a 3D scene, that would alter your perception, alter the perspective of objects. But these objects themselves have no geometric properties, therefore their perception cannot be altered. The only thing that is going to change when you change the lens type is the relationship, the speed relationship, most specifically, between these objects. So I'm going to start with something basic, and later at the end of the video I'm going to show you the differences between different focal length types. Okay, so focal length 100 millimeters, that's good enough. You don't have to go with this. You're gonna discover it on your own. But for now, let's hit OK. Now, for the first time, After Effects is going to give you a warning. Don't worry about it, nothing is wrong. Just read the warning and it's going to make sense. Camera and lights do not affect 2D layers. Select a layer and choose layer 3D layer from the menu. Meaning that, yes, you have set up a camera, but if there are no objects in your scene that are 3D, then that camera isn't going to do anything. Well, After Effects is just warning you about this fact. You can say once per session, and in my case I'm going to say never again because I already know this. Okay, skip the tour please, I know how to use After Effects. Okay, so camera 1 ready. Now I need to make one of these objects 3D so that it starts reacting to the camera. I will do that for Parallax Midground. In here, you're going to see this icon, 3D layer. If you click here, that's going to make it into a 3D layer. Alternatively, you can right-click on that layer and select 3D layer. The difference between a 3D layer and a 2D layer, in this case, just a static image, right, is the position properties. If you can if you can see the parallax background's position, that's only x and y values. That is a two-dimensional method of, inheriting data. Just one dimension, two dimensions, x, y. And if you look at the midground, that's x, y, and z. The third dimension being depth. And as you can see, when I, create this object or make this object into a 3D layer, now I have a pivot attached to it, so I can move it in 3D space. A better way of visualizing this is going to either the top view. From here you can select the top view, and now you're going to be able to visualize this thing in 3D. Or let's go to custom view, and in the custom view you can clearly see that this thing is in 3D space. Now, you won't be able to see the parallax background over here because this is just a helping view. But yeah, you got the idea. So in this case, why is it that nothing has changed? I mean, if you look at let's go back to our active camera. If you convert this midground back to just a 2D layer and go back to 3D layer, its position is not changing. It is not reacting to our newly set up camera. Why is that? Because if you look at the top view, you will see that the vision cone, or this vision pyramid for this camera, is terminating right at the 0 point, and my newly made 3D layer is staying on the 3D point. By default, that's where these objects will begin their lives as 3D objects, both the camera and the layer itself. But if I move one of them, it is going to start reacting in a 3D way. So, for example, let's go back to two views, and let me turn this into top, okay? So, check out the active camera when I push this back in 3D space. Obviously, it is going to almost scale down. It is not scaling down, its scale is still 100%. But remember, this is an object in 3D space, and the further it gets away from the camera, the smaller it's going to get because of perspective. The same thing cannot happen to a 2D layer because, first and foremost, it is not a 3D object. You cannot even push it back in Z space in terms of its depth. Okay? So when this happens, and happen it will, obviously, and you will work with your objects in a certain scale, in a certain pixel dimension, you still want these objects to cover the entire frame, right? Otherwise, they would terminate at weird positions, and you would see those termination lines. You would see where the layer ends. So you're not going to push these back a certain distance to get the parallax effect, because you have to leave space between layers to get the parallaxing, but then you will have to increase their sizes as well, scale them up, okay? Like, let's go with 140 for now, or maybe that's a bit too much. Let's go with 120, and let's just leave it at that. We can clearly see the bottom, but I'm not overly concerned with that. I can even push it even further, because in here there's going to be a foreground element. Now the foreground, even though I'm going to leave it just where it is, I'm not going to play with its settings or its Z depth, I still want it to be 3D so that it can react to everything else. Okay, I'm going to make it a 2D layer or 3D layer, but I'm going to leave it at Z0. Okay, this is my focus layer. Everything is going to happen on this layer. The game will be played on this layer, so I'm going to just leave it where it is. All right. Maybe I can play with its settings later, like I can push it a bit downwards, do the adjustment, and then, for example, the midground layer, I can push it even back, okay, and maybe a bit down. Okay, 120%. I mean, I can scale this up, but it's going to, of course, affect the sizing of these trees as well, since this object is in the background. I want these objects to appear a bit smaller. I'm going to readjust my, let's say, the background sky and mountains. I can even play around with its scale, but I believe that's good enough for now. Okay, so your parallax setup is almost ready, right? There's nothing else to do here. We have to create an animation for the camera, that's for sure. So let's start doing this and start understanding what this is about and what it's going to look like in the end. So what I'm going to do is just push the camera sideways, and as you can see, you can clearly see the foreground layer. So when it starts sticking out, you're going to see some empty space. That's expected. So it's a very good idea to visualize this scene from both a helping view in here and the actual view, the actual thing that you're going to see in the end. You can use both at the same time, and a custom view sometimes is a better approach. And in order to control the camera here, the custom view camera, you can use these functions like orbit, pan, dolly, and the shortcuts for these are 1, 2, and 3 on your keyboard. So 1 orbits the camera, 2 pans it around, and 3 dollies it back. So you can clearly tell what is going on here, how the camera itself is framing these 3D layers, or 2.5D layer system, let's call it. Okay, and when I switch back to top view, you can clearly see that this layer in the back is cutting off. I have lots of space available here, and yeah, not available, but missing here that I need to complete. So this layer should be something larger in the end, as I figured, okay? Because Efe Hoca drew these trees very large, but I want to keep them smaller, so I need to create additional details to fill in the blanks. Now, a mid-ground layer is not going to be the focus, the main focal point of your animation, so it is a good idea to work in a way that these objects, these spaces, let's say, can be doubled up or tripled in a looping, in a tileable fashion. Meaning that I'm going to just increase the size of this using the crop tool, shortcut C, in Photoshop. I'm going to increase the canvas size. I'm just going to get this layer, duplicate it with Control J, push it sideways, connect it to itself, and let's just use a clone stamp to fill in this area over here. I mean, yeah, that's good enough. Nobody is going to realize that connection. Let's just merge these two with Control E to merge down a layer. Then let's crop this back, okay, and save it. Once again, save it as a PNG file. Since I had only one layer, hitting Control S on my keyboard automatically saves this over the original file. So the good thing about After Effects is that it is a reference-based software, meaning that once I update one of the images, one of the assets that I'm referencing inside my project, After Effects will automatically update, as you can see. Now suddenly this layer became much larger, and now I can go back into my midground and scale it down. Okay? Oops, that's not what I wanted. Okay, there you go. All the way in the back. And I can clearly tell that since this is my termination line, everything is working in perfect order. Okay, that's good. All right. So you can start duplicating these layers, or you can start adding it onto itself to create the illusion that it keeps going continuously. And yeah, this is the basic principle. And for example, let's go to the end of this animation, or let's create the animation and let's go to the end of it, and let me give you a few pointers about how you can set up your camera. So I'm going to position my camera at the one end of this foreground element, hit position, okay, and I'm going to go forwards in time to let's say 6 seconds, and I'm going to push it forwards around here. Okay, nothing is sticking out, and that's it basically. This is my camera animation. Let me limit my working space to this so that when I press space I can play back this animation, and an error has occurred and it has crashed. So that's why saving is important, and I didn't save. Just continue, and I need to create this all over again. So let me pause the video here and we'll come back. Okay, we're back. Sorry about that. Snafu. Okay, so let's watch the animation, and this is what it looks like. Congratulations, you just did your first parallax animation. Just position these layers as 3D objects in 3D space, create the Z separation between them, and then just animate the camera. So what does the focal length choices get you? So let's create a new camera. This will be camera 2, and let's try 200 millimeters. And let's create another one, camera 3, with 50 millimeters. Okay, so the last one, the last camera will always be the active one. Okay, this one is camera 2. Okay, so if you turn it off, it's going to go back to the previous camera, camera 1 in this case. Let's set up camera 2 and 3, and in order to do that I'm going to just open up their positions and get here, just turn on their positions, and this is minus 550. So minus 550, not 55. Okay, minus 550. Let's go back all the way over here. This is 2362, 2362, 2362. So basically, all of their field of visions, their vision cones are terminating at the exact same location. After Effects will do that. If they're not, if they're repositioned for some reason, you will have to adjust them. Okay, you'll have to do that, but make sure that they travel in a straight line horizontally. That's important, obviously, and make sure that they're not positioned at, you know, weird heights, because that's going to affect a lot of things. Be careful about that. Okay, if anything goes wrong, you can always reset. All right, so let's go back to the beginning and let's take a look in order. So this is camera 1. Particularly pay attention to the speed difference between the foreground element and the background element, or the midground element, let's say. Okay, hit space, and you can clearly visualize the speed difference. Okay, now let me turn on 200 millimeters. That's camera 2. Obviously, the scale of the objects have changed. That is expected. Okay, but more importantly, take a look at the speed difference. The speed difference is now a lot less. We are compressing this area. We are compressing the space. Not only in terms of the sizing of objects, they are closely sized compared to 100 millimeters, but we are also compressing the speed difference between these two layers as the parallax animation is happening. Now let's watch camera 3, 50 millimeters. Now obviously, since this is covering a wider area, this is a wide angle lens compared to other ones, you can clearly trace that this line is sticking out of the layer in the back, which is the midground. Therefore, its size isn't enough anymore. But more importantly, once again, is the speed difference. Now the speed difference is really exaggerated, right? Not only it is pushed back in terms of its perception, in terms of its optic perception, it appears further in the back than before, even though we didn't change its position, we didn't change its scale, but only thanks to the camera settings, it appears further in the back. It appears smaller, and not just that, it appears much slower as well compared to our foreground element. So the parallax animation is a tug of war between the position of objects in 3D space, mainly the Z depth, right? This final value, their scales, how big they are, and the settings of the camera, particularly the focal length. You play around with 3 of these settings, you set up your layers correctly, figure out how much of an area you need to create, and in the end, you'll get what you want. And this is going to be a sketch animation at first. You're going to explore what options you have available in terms of covering a certain distance and what kind of a parallax animation, what kind of a depth perception it will get you. And then you can finally finalize all of these assets, create the final versions of these assets with whatever techniques you might want, and then you can interchange these newly created assets with the original sketches. It is really easy. If you were to, let's say, alt-click on your keyboard, alt-click and hold on your keyboard, and drag something over a different layer, it's going to automatically change that layer by keeping the settings. Okay, so for example, this object right now is what? Let's say the midground is, oh, there we go. I'm sorry about that. 6,000 pixels by 1090. Okay, so if you are happy with this layer, if you're happy with the animation that you have created, and you want to finalize this asset with a more beautiful rendition, with whatever techniques you might choose, then make sure that this is, once again, 6,000 pixels by 1090 pixels in the end, the final version of it. So if you import it and just alt-click on your keyboard and hold and drag it over the original layer, it's going to change that layer, keeping whatever animation and settings you might have attached to it. That's the basic principle of doing parallax animation. Finally, let's take a look at something we haven't done in the class, and let's turn the background itself into a 3D object. And once we do that, obviously, it is going to appear right on the 0 point, as you can see, blocking our view of this midground layer, because before that, it was a 2-dimensional layer, so it always appeared in the further back. There's nothing I can do to these 3D objects in terms of its in terms of the z values that I can make them appear like behind the background object, because this object is a 2D object and is going to be always rendered first. Okay, so if, for instance, if I convert it back into 2D and it goes back in space, I can still push it forward by using the layer stack. The layer stack trumps everything. The layer stack is more important than everything. But if it's further behind, there is nothing I can do in 3D space to get an object behind this. But if it is in 3D, doesn't matter if it's forward or backwards, or forward or in the layer stack or behind. It is only going to be rendered through 3-dimensional relationship. Okay, so I need to push this way back, further back than anything else, until it appears really, really small, because I want this thing to not become part of the parallax animation in a clearly visible, clearly perceivable way, meaning that it has to be really, really out there far in the distance, because in reality it should be. It is the sky, it is the mountains in the background. It should be far away from the camera. But once I push it far away from the camera, I have to scale it really big, like huge, 1600%, which is a lot, so that once again it fills the entire frame. Now it is incredibly large, but now it is part of the parallax animation. It is doing a slow movement, and After Effects once again decided to crash on me. Okay, don't send, fuck you. I'll solve this problem later. Okay. let's make this background 3D once again, push it behind, make this like, I don't know, 2000%, oh, not position, sorry, scale, 2000%, push it far into the distance, I cannot push it any further because I don't have space. I have to what's the shortcut for this? 16. Oh, I can't do that anymore. Alright, whatever, it's good enough. Okay. Okay, let's try it like this. Yeah, it is still behind, as you can see, and it is becoming a part of the parallax animation, but see how much I need to push it further away from the camera and how big I need to scale it up. If you want to do this for any layer in between, by all means do it. But if there is something in the background that you don't want it to ever move, then just leave it as a 2D layer. It doesn't have to be part of the 3D stack. So just let's get this back to an acceptable setting. Something like this. Okay. In this context, it is not part of the 3D operation anymore. It is just a 2D layer, and it stays where it's put. Okay, but any layers in between, say I want another background layer between this midground element and the mountains in the furthest background, then I need to make it a 3D object and put it in the middle and position it and then scale it appropriately. And if necessary, I have to repeat it a couple of times in order to do less work drawing and creating them. Okay, just make repeatable elements. And finally, I'm going to show you a technique. Let's save this file and let's go back to my example work. So when you look at the background pre-comp, this is the yard of that proof of concept video. Okay, so background BG PNG, this is not actually a hand drawing. Okay, there are repeating elements. The way I do this is, let's go back to my folder for this project and backgrounds. Okay, and in here, let me view by large icon so I can tell what is going on. Okay, so the background element itself, this drawing itself, is actually made out of a couple of assets that is repeating over and over again. So for example, if you take a look, this is just a drawing on paper of these wooden planks, fence in the background. Okay, then I have a bunch of shrubs and weeds, and then I also have trees. Okay, so I scanned these and composited them together in Photoshop in order to create this image. And you can do similar things. You don't have to create something made all out of unique pieces. You can create whatever pieces you need and then you can combine them. You can do this in Photoshop, or you can even do this as a composition inside After Effects. You can create a composition, a huge composition, right? As big as your layer should be, like this one is, for example, 5000 pixels by 1600 pixels. You can create a composition like this, put every material inside of it as much as you need, and then call it into your parallax animation as a layer, which is exactly what is going on here. So when you go back to my main comp plate, let me switch this back to active camera. Okay, So these layers are not actually PNG files, but separate compositions. So if you go to my foreground animation composition, all of the action, the character animations and these trash flying around, glasses breaking and falling and whatever, all of this is happening inside this composition. And then later, this animated layer is being called as a card into that parallax animation. And you can do the same. And I'm going to talk about pre-composing and how you can set up these kind of systems later in a separate tutorial. But for now, this is good enough. Good luck on your parallax animations, and I'll see you next time.